All right, welcome to the webinar, everyone. Straw and Grain Rations with Dwayne Summach. My name is Alicia Sapatic, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. This session is being recorded and will be made available following the live presentation. The presentation is scheduled to take approximately 3/4 of an hour, leaving time for questions and comments. You can type your questions into the chat box throughout the presentation, and they will be handled either throughout the presentation or towards the end, however things are working. If you have difficulties with sound or would like the presenter to slow down, you can also communicate that through the question or chat box in your control panel. And if your control panel disappears during the presentation, the little orange arrow on the top left will bring it back into view. A survey will also appear at the end of the webinar, so please take the time to fill it out as it helps us plan future events. And like I said, Dwayne Summach is our presenter here today. He is a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture based out of Kindersley. And Dwayne recognizes that efficient use of on-farm produced feedstuffs impacts farm profitability. In his role as a livestock and feed extension specialist, Dwayne provides information and recommendations to match feedstuffs to livestock feeding programs with a focus on maximizing livestock productivity and well-being. Dwayne has 20 years of experience advising clients in various aspects of livestock management, ration development, forage production, and utilization. Dwayne has a Master of Science with a focus on grazing ruminant nutrition and a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture or Animal Science from the University of Saskatchewan. So with that, go ahead with your presentation there, Dwayne.
Thank you, Alicia. And I will, at this time, turn my webcam off so we can focus on the presentation. And we will get into the discussion or the presentation on straw and grain rations. And really it's about strategies for using straw effectively. I keep coming back to something my grandpa Rod taught me. He says, ever since the day of threshing machines, we've been feeding cows straw and grain in this country. And it's about making sure that you can thrash enough grain that you don't have to give it all to the cow. So I learned an awful lot from that man, so I'm just trying to pass along what he taught me. So when I look at straw, why do we feed straw to beef cows? Well, it's a forage. And really, I'm looking at what forage is going to be fed this year. And if you're fortunate, you're going to have some green feed. Maybe you'll have chosen to use some glyphosate to terminate that feed. And then you'll have yellow feed. We're seeing questions on canola hay and canola silage. Not an unusual thing, except for the fact that with the price of canola being $20 a bushel, it's got to be a pretty poor canola crop not to justify putting it through the combine. Cereal silage, there is cereal silage out there. If you're in the part of the world that I'm in Kindersley, so I'm responsible for an area kind of from south of Leader all the way up to Macklin. Cereal silage didn't produce a whole lot this year. It can be less than a ton an acre as fed. Some of the yields out there, some of them was at 1 to 3 ton an acre yields, so still not real stellar. Maybe you're going to have access to some lentil or pea straw. Again, by the time it goes through a rotary combine, you got a poor yielding crop. There's not a lot of straw left. But on some of those better crops, we'll still see a half a bale or a bale an acre. And then we've got our traditional cereals. When we think of feeding straw, we traditionally think of feeding cereal straw. And we always get asked the question, well, which straw is better? Oat straw, barley straw, wheat straw. Just as a rule of thumb, I look at oat straw being slightly better than barley straw, which is slightly better than wheat straw. But in a pinch, when push comes to shove, the cows are going to eat straw if you give it to them, if that's what's available to eat. We're also going to see some questions on canola straw. So we'll anticipate some questions on that. And if you're really fortunate, you might even have a little bit of hay to feed to your cows. And I'm going to suggest that most of the time you're going to save most of that hay for lactation or really close into calving. But there is some hay out there that was made from ditches or made from some sloughs that maybe the quality is questionable and maybe we should be feeding it to our dry cows during the maintenance period. So I've kind of already started talking about types of straw. We're also going to talk about the limitations of straw. And really what we're going to focus on is how do we supplement straw to use it well. And we'll even maybe talk about some feeding tips, and we'll mention a couple resources that are available to help us out in making plans for this winter. So this is a pretty typical picture. This year, you're not going to see bales that close together in a lot of the province. So I just grabbed it because it's a nice little sunset type picture in a cereal stubble field. What kind of values are we going to see in cereal straw? Well, if I go to the 2015 feed composition tables from Beef Magazine, they peg oat straw and barley straw at 4% protein. They show energy to be 48 and 44. They show wheat straw as 3% protein and 43% energy. I also throw in the neutral detergent fiber percentage, and you can see the oat straw's got a slight advantage over the barley straw, which is negligible difference to the wheat straw, but it's all over 70% neutral detergent fiber. It's all pretty fibrous. If I go to my cow bites database, it's going to show my oat straw at 4.5% protein, barley straw at 4.2, and wheat straw at 3.9. Our energy contents are very similar at 46 and 44.6, 44.6. Neutral detergent fiber, a little different percentages. Again, it's all over 70. And what I keep going back to is during some of my schooling at university, Dr. Dave Christensen, he always said cereal straw, you can plug in 4% protein, 45% TDN, 70% NDF, and that's going to put you in the ballpark of most cereal straw values. So we're also going to look at some different straws, and I've already mentioned lentil straw. If you happen to be in an area where lentil straw is available, it's usually a pretty decent value. Pea straw as well, however, cows may or may not eat the pea straw as well as they eat the lentil straw. But we can see that the crude protein on those legume straws is up. I typically consider it a crude protein value between 6 and 8, fairly normal for those legume straws. And I'm going to probably plug in the energy pretty close to 50%. Our NDF values are going to be a little bit lower, and a little bit lower, 60 to 65% NDF instead of 70 to 75 NDF. When I look at canola straw, again, it can be highly variable, but we're looking at 4 to 6% protein. And again, we're looking at a lower energy content. We're looking at 40 to 45%, 40 to 44% TDN. Our NDFs are going to be up, pushing onto that 75% content. Flax straw, it tests out at 4.3% protein, but the energy content is down at 40%. Part of that is flax straw. I mean, if we look at what flax was bred for, it was bred for the seed to produce oil. We get the byproduct of meal, but the straw was also bred to produce fiber. And so we get this indigestible, an increased indigestible component in the NDF. So what doesn't show up here is the lignin percentage, and the lignin percentage in flax straw is up over the rest of the kinds of straws. So although we can feed some flax straw, there is additional limitations to flax straw relative to the other straws. In terms of limitations, what are the limitations of straw? Well, the energy content is typically lower than the requirements of the cattle. The protein content is lower than the requirements, and the high fiber content is going to limit the amount that they can eat. And so for a rule of thumb, we use 1.2% of body weight as the maximum amount of neutral detergent fiber. Now that 1.2 is a guideline. It could be 1.3, could be 1.4, it could be 1. Okay, but it gives us some guidelines. And so when we're looking at a 1,400 pound cow, we're really looking at pretty close to 22 pounds of as fed material is what we're looking at. And so I try and make sure that I'm under that number when I'm formulating diets for cows based on straw. Of course, we've got to pay attention to who it is that we're feeding. Depending on that cow, depending on what stage of pregnancy she's in, it changes the targets that we're shooting for. And so we can accomplish a lot of things with a lot of different forages, but we need to pay attention to, we need to meet the requirements. What does the cow actually need? Now, if we're trying to feed a heifer calf, it's another set of parameters again. And one of the biggest issues with feeding straw to calves is that high fiber content, their small stomach, how much feed can you actually put in them? And so a ration for calves will look similar but different than what we're building for cows. What I'm going to talk to about today is based on certain parameters. And I just want to remind everyone that when we get beyond those parameters, we've got to feed additional energy. And so if we're talking about, so I balance most of my rations for minus 20 degrees centigrade, basically our average temperature in January, February. But if the daytime high is going to be minus 25, well, then you need to throw another 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds of grain into the mix. If it's if the daytime high is only going to be minus 30, we're talking an extra 3 or 4 pounds. If the daytime high is minus 35, it's another couple more pounds. So we're up to 6 additional pounds. And you're going to see once we get into the actual rations that we're already feeding quite a bit of grain. So to add 6 more pounds of grain means that we might even be looking at having to split. If we're not providing a TMR, we might be splitting the grain into 3. We might have to deliver it at 3 different points in time throughout the day. So if I'm supplementing straw, well, I could supplement them with some other better quality forage. You know, really I'm stretching some better quality forage out, whether that be green feed or silage, whether it be some lentils or peas, whether it be alfalfa, but I might also be feeding grain, right? And so the top one there is some split lentils. Rarely have I seen lentils actually go into a cow ration unless they happen to be, well, I got a bin bottom that's left over that I can't sell because it's less than 100 bushel. But quite often what we'll see going into cow rations will be screenings, the lentil screenings off of a seed cleaning plant. And of course, there's our traditional cereal grains, whether it be wheat, barley, or oats that we would normally feed to cows. So we can feed a ration that is just straw and grain, and then we better pay attention to our mineral content. But you can see that, you know, 20 pounds of straw, and what I've done here is I've taken wheat straw, barley straw, and oat straw and combined them together in equal proportions to create cereal straw. They're relatively close together to the same value, so don't get hung up on it. It's just a value, you know. And so if we want to feed 20 pounds of cereal straw, it's going to take 10 pounds of grain to go with it. We also need to balance the minerals, and one of the minerals we've got to pay attention to is the limestone, is the calcium. When we're feeding these high cereal grain rations, the calcium to phosphorus ratio can get out of balance really quick. And even feeding an extra ounce of limestone, we're still not quite at 2 to 1. You know, we're 36 grams of calcium and 27 grams of phosphorus. That's kind of the minimum place I'd want to be, and I might even consider feeding 2 ounces of limestone to help balance this ration. If I look at doing it a little bit different, if I look at using a 32% beef sup, a commercially available sup, I'm showing a 3211. That means 11% of the crude protein is coming from non-protein nitrogen sources. It could be 3220 would be another common one. When we're feeding straw plus a bunch of grain plus the supplement, the grain works with the non-protein nitrogen in the rumen so that the microbes can efficiently use the forage available. Okay, so, but we can see that by adding 1 pound of sup, I displace 2 pounds of grain. Relative pricing, I mean, pricing is your best guess as to what it's going to be. I plugged in some numbers. I realize that they may be on the low side, but it's just, you got to have some numbers. And just trying to keep things rolling along, you see that there's one pound of supplement displaces 2 pounds of grain. And that's kind of the main point of this slide is when we use a commercially prepared beef supplement, it does help us balance our protein better than just providing straight grain, because we actually have to overfeed energy to provide enough protein when we're using barley as our protein supplement. Again, still got to pay attention to our calcium to phosphorus ratio, still having to add a little bit of limestone. Again, that's going to depend on your commercially prepared supplement, but there is a limit to how much calcium they can add in a commercially prepared supplement. It's hard to push the rock mineral through the dye, so there is limitations. But so a little bit of supplement can go a long way. Instead of
Dwayne,
supplement,
just a question on that.
yep, go ahead.
About the limestone, from a practical perspective, how much limestone can we expect a cow to eat? Mixing it with grain, sometimes the amount can get settled out and uneaten.
Yeah, and so really good question. When we are feeding limestone, when you think of your commercially prepared mineral, your 2-to-1 mineral is a bunch of limestone already. Adding additional limestone depends on how much grain I'm feeding. If I'm only feeding 3 pounds of grain, I can't put a lot more than about 150 grams of total limestone and mineral combined into that, which is 6 ounces. But if I'm feeding 8 pounds of grain, I can feed almost double that amount of limestone. So but again, it's going to want to settle out on you and do some other things, but everything is relative, right? It's relative to another thing that's happening. And then if we go to a TMR, if we actually are feeding a little bit of silage and we can stick the mineral component to some wet feed and spread it out through the whole ration, it changes the amount you can go again. But typically I'm not going to try and go much over half a pound of mineral and salt. But that's where we got to end up with some of these rations in order to keep the calcium to phosphorus ratio in balance. So, but there is a practical limit. And then the other problem is if you're expecting them to eat it free choice, just limestone by itself, yeah, we can get into a lot of trouble that way. So I wouldn't, most of what I'm talking about here today, when I'm talking about supplementing limestone, I'm assuming that we've mixed it in with the grain. So good question. So rather than just straight up using supplement, maybe I have access to canola meal. And so canola meal does a couple things. It provides protein. It also provides a little bit of energy. And you can see here that I can feed two-thirds of a pound of canola meal replaces the pound of supplement, but then I have to go back and add in quite a bit more mineral and limestone. So around and around the dance goes as to which is your most cost-efficient way to do things. But I'm just wanting to show you the options. But the canola meal does a lot of things in terms of balancing the protein in a very nice manner. You can see that we're at 8 pounds of grain still, but our average daily gain at 0.3, that's kind of what our target needs to be. I'm assuming we're maintaining a cow. Again, this is at 6 months pregnant and probably late November, early December timeframe in terms of it's set up for a -10 and protected from wind. So just showing you that there's a whole bunch of different ways to go about it. But we still have to make sure that we're meeting the energy requirements, the protein requirements, the mineral requirements, the vitamin requirements in order to keep that cow healthy and productive. Now, I mentioned earlier that if we can get into some different kinds of straw, we change the picture again. And so I've just done up a ration here. We're keeping the cow the same here for most of these rations. When we get to the end of the last one, I'll show you a little different cow profile. But if we go to lentil straw, okay, I can meet her protein requirements much quicker because the lentil straw has a little higher protein to start with. And so all of a sudden with 12 pounds of lentil straw, and I can still feed 10 pounds of cereal straw. And so I got 22 pounds of straw going into her. So she's happy, she's satisfied, she's full. I only need 6.5 pounds of grain to go with that combination. Now, feeding that combination creates other issues. How are we going to do it? Are we going to have the tub grinder in to blend the pile together? Do we have a vertical mixer that we're going to mix it every load as we go? There's all kinds of different logistics questions as to how we're going to do that. Are we going to roll out the lentil straw and just have to limit feed it, and then are we going to have the cereal straw free choice available to them on the bedding pile? There's a whole bunch of different ways to go about it. But I'm showing you that all of a sudden 6.5 pounds of barley, no additional canola meal, no beef sup, but we've met her protein requirements, we've met her energy requirements. And the other thing that those legume straws do is they do help balance the calcium to phosphorus ratio. They have a higher calcium content and lower phosphorus content inherently, and so they help start balancing that ratio, although a lot of that calcium is tied up in the indigestible portion of the fiber. So I wouldn't go away from feeding no mineral, but I would be quite content to back off the mineral inclusion that we need to provide in this type of thing. But we do need to pay attention to our trace mineral status. Some different things happen with those legume straws in terms of the trace mineral content. So we need to pay attention and just make sure that we're providing everything that the cow needs. Now, if you happen to be in a situation where you do actually have a little bit of hay that we've got enough hay on hand that we can feed a little bit of hay all the way through, that can be a really good way of going about it too. You can see here, I've got 20 pounds of straw in. I've thrown 4 pounds of alfalfa grass hay, which is still a pretty mature hay, 14% protein and a 60% TDN. That's a pretty good hay. And I have seen tests on hay. The little bit of hay that we do have was testing out pretty good this year, as long as it was cut in a timely manner. I'm only needing 6 pounds of barley to get the energy content to where it needs to be. And minerals, again, by having that hay, it helps balance the mineral content. So again, makes for a pretty good ration. The trick for this is always, how do I feed 4 pounds of hay? And if you're limit feeding the hay, you really have to stretch it out and let everybody have access. At 4 pounds, I'm almost tempted to mix a partial TMR where the grain and the hay are put together, and I feed 10 pounds of that. And that's what goes out on my limit feeding out on the bunks or on the ground, but you got to make sure that everybody gets a chance to access that, and then you can free choice the straw. The other option is to try and figure out how to blend the straw and the hay together, and again, that's a logistics question. Here's the one where we've changed up the parameters, and so now we're getting into a cow that is more farther along in pregnancy, and we're getting into colder temperatures. So she's now 8 months pregnant, and we're probably in February, it's -20 out, and so it's increased her energy requirements. You know, even with the straw, the canola meal, and barley grain, you can see that I'm needing to feed 11.5 pounds of barley and 3/4 of a pound of canola meal to support that cow. You're seeing here that that's 0.2 pounds of limestone in addition to the 2 ounces of mineral. So 0.11 is basically 2 ounces or 50 grams, real close to 50 grams. 0.22 is real close to 100 grams. So you're seeing that we're adding quite a bit of rock to this to get them to keep that calcium to phosphorus ratio in check, in balance, not in check, in balance. And this is not a cheap ration, right? And I mean, I've got straw pegged in at $60 a ton. That is not I mean, it's pretty common to hear $50 a bale or $60 a bale now, right now too. So maybe my straw is underpriced. 225 for the alfalfa, $378.81. That's coming off of last week's livestock update, the beef cattle market update. Basically $8.75 a bushel. Canola meal at $4.15. Maybe that's a little low. I know that there's been canola meal traded here lately at right around that number though, so it's not right out of the ballpark. And we're looking at 286 per cow per day, and that's on about that's cutting it as tight as I would want to cut it on a straw ration. Now we can go through all the variables and show you all the other different types of ways of getting there, but let's just assume that as she gets more pregnant, I can come up with a variation on the lentil straw, on adding a little bit of hay, and it plays with the different numbers, right? But there are ways to do it. What I will tell you is that when we try to go to lactation rations, that it is very difficult to meet the cow's energy requirements with any significant amount of straw. I'm hard pressed to develop a ration that has much more than 8 pounds of straw for a lactating cow in it. We need to have green feed, we need to have silage, we need to have hay, you need to have some better quality forage, or you end up feeding a lot of grain to the cow. And that creates some other issues that we have to be careful with. So it was kind of one of those things that do you even spend time showing you how poor it looks? And my decision was no, it really, straw has a place. It's for feeding the dry, it's the maintenance cow. It's about providing filler. But once she gets to the place where the calf is getting really big inside her and her nutrient demands are going up, there's not a lot of room for filler. And so we have to pull back on the amount of straw we're feeding. I'm still showing them that we can feed 20 pounds. I would consider this a pretty extreme case. I wouldn't want to be feeding a cow this much straw that late in pregnancy. I would like to see some type of better quality forage in there with it. But can it be done? Yes, it can. Is it the best thing to be doing? It's amazing how even 5 to 6 pounds of better quality forage goes a long way to helping this out. And I would really encourage you to think of rations in terms of second trimester. We can build it basically mostly on straw. Third trimester, we better be looking at straw. Should probably be, let's shoot for half of the forage intake is straw, the other half is a better quality forage. And then once we're into lactation, we need to think about it. From a planning perspective, I would plan to not use straw in lactation, and that's kind of where I tend to put my thought processes in terms of how to best utilize my low quality forages. So one of the resources that we do have available is there is a document on our website. It's called the Beef Cow Rations and Winter Feeding Guidelines. And a gentleman by the name of Brian Doig went ahead and prepared a whole bunch of different rations. You got to be careful. You got to look at whether it's 1,200 pound cow or 1,000 pound cow, 1,200 pound cow, or 1,400 pound cow. Need to be honest with yourself. How heavy is that cow weigh when she's in body condition score 3 or better? And That's on the Canadian 1 to 5 scale. Don't just take your cull cow weights of your body condition score 1.5 and 2 cows. You need to tack on another 150 or 200 pounds to those thinner cows to be really accurate on what you're looking at. Best case scenario, you actually have a scale on farm and you've run a portion of the herd over a few different times a year and you have a pretty good handle on what you're feeding. Cow size matters because it affects their nutrient requirements. In terms of action items, what I really want to encourage you to do is, in order to develop your winter feeding plan, you need to take an inventory. You need to know how many bales of which kind that you have. You're going to need to test the quality. And this year, testing quality is going to be really important. There is going to be quality all over the map because of the environmental conditions. It will be very difficult to know. I'm most familiar with what's basically happened west of Saskatoon and south of North Battleford, all the way down through Swift Current and to the border. That's kind of the territory that I've been operating in here the last 6 months. And there's some really weird cereal grain crops that were turned into green feed. When you've got some of the field that it's in the hard dough stage, but you got other parts of the field that the head came out of the boot and then just kind of quit. It just stalled out right there and there was no grain fill at all. It's going to make for some different kind of feed, and without testing each individual batch, we really aren't going to know what the quality of that feed is. And if we're going to push the envelope on terms of protein supplementation and protein contents, you're going to need to know what it is. Then you're going to need to take that knowledge gained from your inventory and your quality, and you're going to have to use some tools and resources, and you're going to come up with a plan A. And for most of us, we're already on to plan C, D, and F, G, H, J, K. Maybe you're already back around to double A's and double B's. It's this kind of year, we've just rolled with it. I know just last week, 2 weeks ago, we were talking canola. I'm like, at $20 a bushel canola, there's not a lot of point to talking about canola silage. There's not a lot of talk about canola straw even, because by the time they combine it and put the straw through, there's not going to be a lot left to bale. Well, a week ago, we had a hailstorm travel 30 miles down Highway 7, and all of a sudden the canola has no actual canola. It's now just canola straw standing there. If we go in and cut it with a swather, it's going to make a swath that can bale. All of a sudden now feeding canola straw is on the table. What I didn't talk about in terms of canola straw is that because of the sulfur content, we do have to pay attention to the sulfur levels in the whole ration. And typically we're going to see that our canola straw inclusion rates are probably going to be somewhere between 25% and 40% of the total ration, which typically means that we're talking about it'll be 50% of the forage component. So there's just a couple different things that happen there. Yeah, we can use it. It's not, the cows take a little bit to get used to eating it. We're going to have to figure out how to blend it. All those kind of things come into play. But yes, there is different things available, and as the environmental conditions are unique to everyone's place this year, the forage resources that you're going to have available are going to be unique. Can we feed a lot more grain than this? Yes, we can. The price of grain today, though, dictates that we probably want to minimize the amount of grain that we're providing. We're gonna go with the amount that just provides enough energy. We're not going to overfeed energy because it's cheaper to feed grain than it is to try and find more forage to fill them up with. So there have been years where that's been the case. This will not be one of those years. So we also need to make sure that we're monitoring. We need to monitor our feed intakes. We need to monitor body condition score, and we need to be ready to move on to what's the next thing that we need to do. What else have we considered? What are our next options? And there's different things out there, but you need to get started on this. I'm sure most of you that are watching this webinar have already you're already tracking your inventory closely. It's typically been the rule of thumb has been you need a bale of cow a month, typically for 6 months. Well, this year I'm going to challenge you that we likely need to plan on a 225-day feeding period. I realize that we still have stubble grazing to go to. That 225-day winter feeding period will include your swath grazing, your corn grazing. However, I'm going to suggest to you that any stubble grazing this fall is probably going to be a third of what you would normally expect. The amount of grass in the edge margins and in the draws and stuff, it's been dry. It's produced a lot less than normal. The crop aftermath will be a lot less than it has traditionally been. So all of a sudden, your fall grazing period has gotten shortened up quite a bit. And I'm hearing about cows coming home from pasture. Target dates are already by the middle of September. Cows are going to be out of some of the big community pastures. And I'm looking at it going, I'm thinking we need to plan on feeding from either Thanksgiving or November 1st, and then you're going to be feeding all the way to June 1st. So whether you start feeding a little bit earlier this fall and get to pasture by kind of the middle of May next year, or whether you stretch the resources a little bit more this fall and then have to feed until June, it's going to be a long winter feeding period. And so all of a sudden 6 bales of cow isn't the number you need to have. It's probably closer to 8. So just giving you some things to think about in terms of being realistic with your plan. Yeah, there's different ways to go about it, and that's kind of part of why we're here. That resource that I referred to, it's on the website. Be aware that it's in the process of being updated. So what you see there today, 2 or 3 weeks from now, might look a little bit different, but what's there today will still help you quite a bit. So with that, if there's any additional specific questions that I haven't already addressed, I'd be quite happy to take them at this time.
Great, thanks, Dwayne. Appreciate that. We do have a few questions here. One just asking about feed testing straw. You shared some average values there. Is it important to feed test straw year to year?
So year to year, I don't get too excited about straw. I usually use a book value on straw. This year would be one of the years that you probably shouldn't use a book value. We could be surprised. There was a lot of nitrogen put down with a lot of crop expectations of 40 or 50 bushel an acre wheat, and you only get 10 or 12. Well, there was nitrogen there, and the plant probably took some up, and so the protein content of the straw might be up on a little on the higher side. You need to know what it is. So I look at the $50 and go, yeah, but it's an investment in knowing what you have. The pea and lentil straw is always variable. Canola straw, again, high variability. So if we're making up the bulk of the ration, I do want to know what my forage that's making up the bulk of the ration does contain. Quite often when we use a book value on straw, it's because we're feeding 5 or 8 pounds of straw to stretch a mostly hay ration out. At that point, using a book value makes a little bit of sense. But when it's the bulk of the ration, it makes sense to know what it actually is. So.
Perfect. And in some of those cases, probably be important to include testing for nitrates and sulfur and things like that if it's making the bulk of the ration.
Yeah, if we're talking canola straw, we want to add the sulfur to it. Typically, if we had a crop make it all the way to the point that it got combined, do we add the nitrates to it? If it was a low yielding crop on a high fertility, in a high fertility situation, I might add the nitrates to it as well.
Okay, great. And the next question here, I'm just talking about split feeding grain. At what points should we split feed grain? And would there be a maximum amount to feed to a cow before you get into any risk of digestive upsets?
So the rule of thumb that I use is 8 pounds per feeding with a minimum of 3 hours between feedings. In terms of maximum amount of digest before problems, well, I know that in the feedlot we're down to 5% forage on the dry matter basis. That's a lot of grain that we can feed a cow. I would suggest on a cow-calf operation that you're not ever going to get to that level, but it's pretty easy to see that, you know, if you've got grain available and it's hard to find forage to go with it, I mean, we can feed 20, 24 pounds of grain to a cow. 24 pounds means that we're at 3 feedings of 8 pounds a day, right? So we want to split them out and spread them out as far as we can. It's about the amount at each feeding. When you start feeding cows that much grain, they can stop eating the forage on you though. So, and of course, providing that much grain, it's the real trick is how do you make sure that everybody gets to eat the same amount? There will be boss cows that will consume 30 or 32 pounds of grain a day on you. So but we can feed a lot of grain if we do it in a manner that makes sense. If we just go out there and throw 24 pounds of grain out there, we'll have cows that'll be okay, and we'll have cows that have a lot of digestive upset. So, but I just stick to that 8 pounds per feeding, and that goes a long way to helping minimize some of those issues.
For sure. And the next question about sheep, how would those recommendations change for sheep, or where would you recommend sheep producers go for assistance with straw and grain rations?
So again, with sheep, they're kind of that, I treat sheep a little bit as a cross between the beef cow and the dairy cow when I'm thinking of them. They are a smaller ruminant, so they have a smaller capacity. When we're talking about maintenance rations for sheep, we can maintain sheep on a predominantly straw-based ration with some grain and supplement. Once we talk about pregnant sheep, we usually have to include some better quality forage in there. And when we get into late gestation, I mean, when they're carrying twins and triplets, there's not a lot of room, and we have to feed them well. And lactation, they're a small dairy cow, and when we look at dairy cows lactation rations, we're talking the best quality forage that we can find, and we're still feeding 50% grain with a lot of that really high quality forage to maximize milk production. And that's really what we're doing when we're feeding sheep that are lactating. So again, basically you cut everything, divide everything by 5, and you're getting close to a sheep ration. But for specific ration information on sheep, you should probably contact a nutritionist, either a livestock and feed extension specialist in your region, or a private consulting nutritionist, or somebody on staff. Your sheep feed salesman should have the ability to put you in touch with someone that can help you out with that type of information. But for sure, there are definitely resources around to help balance sheep rations, as well as there are resources to help with the cow rations. So.
Great, thanks, Dwayne. A couple questions going back to the feed testing side of things. How important is it to feed test grain?
So grain, every sample will be slightly different, but grain does have a lot more consistency to it as long as it's meeting the minimum specification parameters. What we see with grain that is offered to livestock producers is that it's usually off somehow. Either it's lightweight, it's got something in it. It's got extra dockage in it. It'll have something going on with it, and that's when you get into some of that kind of stuff. Then it's important to test the grain. Again, what are we really testing for? We're testing for protein and energy content because we want to know. The other way to approach it is that we assume that it's close to average, but we discount it just a little bit. And that way you err on the side of caution and you're overfeeding your energy and protein. So in a perfect world, yes, we test our grain. In reality, probably we're going to use a book value for grain most of the time.
Okay, sounds good. The next question on feed testing. If you have a straw feed test from last year and have some straw left over this year to feed, how much will it change from year to year, if at all?
So if I got a feed test for my residual straw, my leftover straw, I'm going to go ahead and use it. It will have actually probably broken down a little bit over the course of the year. The cattle will actually be able to eat a little bit more of 2-year-old straw. Again, it's going to have changed a little bit, but I would be confident in using the information from last year's feed test on last year's straw. I wouldn't want to use last year's feed test to estimate what this year's straw is going to be.
Great. The next question, at what % of the diet do you need to worry about impaction with straw?
So the diets I'm dealing with here, impaction is real if we don't balance for protein. It's when we don't provide enough protein and energy, then the bugs in the rumen can't break down and digest the straw, and particles start going through undigested, and that's where we get impaction. We also get impaction when we just keep trying to feed her more and more straw. And so I didn't talk about physically changing the structure of the straw when we grind the straw and break it into smaller pieces, whether it be straw or whether it be oat hulls. If we just feed the cow too much and don't give her anything else to balance the ration with, and we just give her free choice straw, she will impact. Typically, if we were to try and squeeze 22 or 24 pounds of straw into the ration and only feed 4 pounds of grain, you're probably flirting with impaction. The rations that I showed you here today, when we're talking about 6.5 or 8 pounds, 6.5 pounds of grain plus another 2/3 of a pound of canola meal, or another pound of supplement, 32% supplement, I'm not concerned about impaction with those types of rations. But if we just try and do the strong grain thing and we try and really skimp on the grain because it's expensive this year, that's, if we were only feeding 4 pounds of straw instead of 12, or 4 pounds of grain instead of 12, yeah, then I'd be worried about impaction. So I know it's not a clean answer, but the reality is one cow will stand at the bale feeder and eat nothing but straw and leave the grain, and she seems to get through the year. And then you'll have another cow that that she ate 10 pounds of grain, and she still, she points 4 feet in the air and you open her up and she's packed full. So it's still variable. Every cow responds a little bit differently, but if I'm feeding much under 6 pounds of grain, I got to start thinking about impaction to a mature animal.
Okay. And the next question here, what is the minimum amount of functional fiber needed in a beef cow ration?
I don't know that we've actually, Greg Penner's maybe started to ask some of those kind of questions. We look at functional fiber on the dairy cow. Again, that's a different number than the functional fiber in a feedlot steer. And define functional fiber. I look at functional fiber as it needs to be more than 3/4 of an inch particle length, and I really like it if it's greater than 3/4 of an inch, 1.5 inches. And we probably need somewhere in the range of 12 to 15% to make the rumen function well. So it is a lot lower than the numbers that we're dealing with here. Again, that would be in a type of scenario where we're feeding 20 or 22 pounds of grain, and we'd only be feeding 3 or 4 pounds of fiber forage to go with it. If we're trying to squeeze in the fiber from finely ground particles to compress into cubes or pellets, basically the cubes we can get a little functional fiber out of the pellets. It's been ground so fine that it's essentially no functional fiber in an alfalfa pellet.
Okay, great. And there are a few more questions coming in here, which is great. If you do have questions, feel free to type them into the question or chat box there. If your control panel has closed, you can press that orange arrow and I'll bring it back out into view. A couple of questions here, Dwayne, about will chopping the straw increase intake, and can you feed more of it then?
So chopping the straw does allow us to increase intake, but it really doesn't change the neutral detergent fiber content. And so our maximum amount of straw is still our maximum amount of straw. What chopping the straw will do will allow them to eat more and move towards impaction faster. I'm assuming that we're talking about chopping straw through a tub grinder or a New Holland mix mill where we're still leaving the particle length, over that inch long. If we're trying to shove it through a 3/8 screen, all of a sudden it's pretty fine.
For sure. And I know our next webinar here will touch on this topic, Dwayne, but if you have any comments, feel free to add any benefit to ammoniated straw and any feeding concerns with that.
So that is that's one of the main topics for the next webinar. And I would say that ammoniated straw does have a place. Murray's going to touch on it a lot more detail next week. I look at it in terms of there's a lot of safety issues around how do you get the straw ammoniated as well. And that comes as somebody that spent 3 years custom applying anhydrous ammonia. So I'm very familiar with anhydrous ammonia and treat it with the respect it deserves. But it does increase your non-protein nitrogen. It does help preserve damp feed. In terms of NPN, I think there are other ways to achieve the provision of crude protein equivalents that are probably more cost effective and a whole lot more occupational health and safety friendly. But that's my comments on that, and tune in for next Murray Feist's webinar next week.
Yes, we've shared that link in the chat. Yeah, we've shared the link in the chat, so feel free to go ahead and register for that one if you haven't already. A couple more comments and questions here, Dwayne. Any advice for bison producers wanting to utilize straw rations?
So bison are, they like low quality roughage to start with for the winter feeding period. Again, it's about intake, and they can still impact if we're just talking straw. Murray again would be a better guy to ask about bison rations, but I do know that I would be reluctant to go to straight straw, even on a bison. They still need something to go with it to balance it out, and it typically requires some additional energy and some additional protein to make the straw work. And again, typically it's usually a barley straw or an oat straw that we're putting in front of the bison, just from a feed in from something that they're willing to eat.
Okay, and the next question here, do you have any advice for straw-based rations for growing replacement heifers? This would be beef heifers.
Yeah, so growing beef heifers on straw-based rations, we have to really pay attention to what their nutrient requirements are. We have to be realistic with ourselves about what we're trying to accomplish, what rate of gain. We have to be careful that we balance the protein requirement, because if we just feed them grain to meet their protein requirement, you're likely going to end up with excess fat deposition in the udder and lower milk production as a result. You know, we can get the cows, we can get those weaned calves or to grow on it, but we have to balance the whole ration. I prefer to see on weaned calves, I prefer to see straw as no more than 50% of the roughage. Treat them more like they're in a late, I would treat them more like a late gestation cow, or maybe even into lactation, where a straw-based ration for replacement heifers is you got to know what you're doing, and it's about making sure that everybody gets the same amount too, because the feed delivery on that can be a real source of variability of what each animal's eating. So there's a few of those different things that you need to think about if you're going to go the route of trying to do a straw-based ration for replacement heifers. Can it be done? Yes, with a lot of caution.
Okay, great. And are you able to share a copy of your presentation with us today, Dwayne? And we can make that available through myself if people want a copy. If you're able to share it, they can just email me and we can send that out.
Yep, you know that you can access it. So
okay,
we'll put it a place that Alicia can get to it.
Okay, sounds great. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So any other final comments from you there, Dwayne, or resources to point people to, anything like that?
The big one is just know who your livestock and feed extension specialist is, and don't be scared to ask questions. If you have cow bites, don't be afraid to use it and come up with some wild and wacky iterations of feeding programs. I would ask that you really think about it. I showed you basically the first side, the left side of cow bites. When you go to the right side, there's also this section that's called DIP and UIP, digestible intake protein, undigestible intake protein, and metabolizable protein. On straw rations, we have to pay attention that we actually meet the digestible intake protein requirements and along with the metabolizable protein requirements. As long as you've met the digestible intake protein requirements and the metabolizable protein intake requirements, if your undigestible intake protein requirements are slightly undervalued, I don't get too excited. Usually you'll see it the other way around, though, that the undigestible intake protein has been met and the digestible intake protein hasn't been met. So just because crude protein is adequate on straw-based rations, that's kind of where we got to go. We need to take that next step and look at that right-hand side and look at those, where that protein is coming from and where it's being absorbed in the animal. If we're not meeting those digestible intake protein requirements, we're not feeding the bugs in the rumen. If we're not feeding the bugs in the rumen, they're not digesting the straw. So just a couple other little things to think about there, but you know, this is my contact information. Again, reach out to your regional livestock and feed extension specialist. And that does bring us to the conclusion of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Dwayne. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us for this webinar on straw and grain rations, and especially you, Dwayne, for putting this presentation together. Really appreciate it. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. The link has been posted in the chat there. And we also look forward to you joining our next webinar, which is on molasses and straw, ammoniization, and liquid protein supplements with Murray Feist on September 7th. If you have any comments or questions, like Dwayne said, please reach out to us. I put the number in the chat there as well, but 1-866-457-2377 is the Agriculture Knowledge Center, and they can put you in contact with your local specialist as well. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.